Welcome to episode 200 of the 40-Year Sim. If you recall episode 100, we recapped the first 10 seasons of the Sim. Well, on this episode, we're recapping it from 93 to 2002. So the last 10 seasons of the 40-Year Sim is what we'll be going over. So let's check out the playoff brackets. Starting from 93, the Bulls beat the Suns 4-2 to win back-to-back championships. That was fun. Then in 94, the Houston Rockets beat the Bullets. The Bullets beat the Bulls in round 2 and then went on to lose to the Rockets in 7 games in 94. Then in 95, the Bulls came roaring back, sweeping the Rockets in the finals and starting off a huge run, which included the 96 finals, where once again they met with the Rockets, and this time they beat them in 5. So that was back-to-back championships for the Bulls. And then in 97, the Kings gave them a big test, but the Bulls came out on top yet again to get a 3-peat in 97. And then in 98, a 4-peat. They beat the Supersonics. They beat the Supersonics in 6 games to win 4 straight. And then finally, the dynasty ended in 99 when the Lakers beat them in 6. Which is ironic because the Lakers beat them in 91 just before the dynasty started. Then in 2000, Michael Jordan joined the Hornets and lost in the finals to Jason Kidd and the Warriors. I'm still wondering how that happened. And then last 2 years, Lakers lost to the Hawks in 6 games in the 2001 finals. And then in 2002, the most recent finals, we had the Lakers beat the Miami Heat in 5 games. Shaq and Kobe now have 2 rings. So those are the brackets of the last 10 years. Now let's do a recap of each team in the NBA, starting with the Sixers. The Sixers missed the playoffs for a number of seasons in a row. Finally, things started to catch on for them in 99 when they won 52 games, made it all the way to the conference finals. But since then, they took a step back, and they haven't really been the same ever since. Had some great drafts over the years. Ben Robinson, Marcus Camby, and Mehmet Okur are still on the team. It's interesting to see how their roster evolved over the years. They went through a lot of changes during those rebuilding years until they finally settled on Nick Van Exel, Kerry Kittles, Glenn Robinson, Vin Baker, Marcus Camby by 97. Then, middle of the 99 season, they decided to trade away Kerry Kittles and Vin Baker to get Eddie Jones, and it was that squad who made it to the conference finals and took the Bulls to 7 games. But then Danny Manning declined in 2000, so the team declined as well. They traded for Elton Brand in 2001, but he didn't really move the needle for them either. So let's look at the 2003 roster and see what's up. Nick Van Exel's back, Eddie Jones is back, Glenn Robinson is back, but Kurt Thomas is now the starting power forward, Marcus Camby is starting center. They got Chucky Atkins in that trade with the Rockets. He's their backup point. Aaron McKee's still there, Ron Mercer. Then they have Vladimir Radvanovich, John Wallace, Ivano Nubil, Johnny Taylor, Bluthendal, the rookie, and then Andres Notioni and Meokur at the end of the bench. I really like this squad. I think this squad is enough to make it to the playoffs. I don't know how far they can go exactly, but I definitely think this is a playoff squad for sure. The Milwaukee Bucks were one of the elite teams in the East in the mid to late 90s, but unfortunately, they were unable to get past the Bulls. Eventually, Shaq left, Penny left, but they were able to trade both, which left them with a lot of assets. So if you check out their draft history, very lucky they were. Shaq, Penny, Brent Barry, they got Dirk in 98 who's still on the team, Manu Ginobili, Jamal Crawford, Tyson Chandler, Mike Dunleavy. Yeah, the future is very, very bright for this Bucks squad, but let's take a look back at their roster from the 90s. You had Penny and Shaq anchoring the team eventually. They got Horace Grant. They had Nick Anderson. Yes, I was very much trying to ape those Magic teams. But, you had some interesting other players mixed in there. Kendall Gill, Xavier McDaniel, Mark Aguirre, Brent Barry. I wanted to try different flavors year to year to see if this team could be strong enough to beat the Bulls. Unfortunately, they weren't. And then they eventually evolved. Thanks to those draft picks, they evolved into the team that they are now, with Dirk becoming the number 1 guy. And they got Jason Terry, Manu Ginobili. They're all still in the team. Let's take a look at the team in 2003. Jason Terry starting at point guard, Manu Ginobili, Derek McKee at small forward, Dirk Nowitzki, Tyson Chandler is the starting center now, Jim Jackson coming off the bench, Danielle Marshall, Shandon Anderson, Earl Boykins, their backup point, Jamal Crawford coming off the bench, Jake Crossover, Howard Isley, Doug Smith, Mike Dunleavy. This is a really good squad. I mean, I don't know if they're going to be able to get very far this year, but you can just feel it, right? This team is really going to do some damage. The Chicago Bulls were a dynasty in the 90s. They won 4 straight championships in the Sim. They made it to another finals in 99. They won 6 total. They made it to 8 total finals in the 90s. It's absolutely a monster to deal with thanks to MJ and Pippen. As of late, they've had some nice draft picks. Jason Richardson, Shane Battier, Zach Randolph, and Jay Williams. We'll see how this rebuild continues to unfold in the early to mid-2000s. Looking back, you know, they had B.J. Armstrong, MJ, Pippen, Horace Grant, you know, those early 90s Bulls squad. Then they morphed into the late 90s Bulls squad earlier than I had anticipated, but it made sense. Dennis Rodman was a free agent. Ron Harper had 1 year left in his deal. It made sense to do the trade right then and there in 95. And man, that's when things took a turn and they won 4 straight championships. Now they're in this rebuild. They got a lot of young pieces, a lot of interesting players, but it's kind of, we'll see how things go. Jay Williams is their starting point guard for 2003. Jason Richardson is back. He was a dynamic player. We saw a little bit of some highlights from him in 2002. We'll see if he continues to play well. Shane Battier is now the starting small forward. Andre Kirilenko is back, now playing power forward. And they signed Greg Ostertag as center. So we're hoping this team is better than 10-72. They have a lot of interesting bench players like Troy Hudson, Carlos Arroyo, Stromile Swift, Zach Randolph, who I hope eventually will become a starter for them. Yeah, this team, they got the players, but can they actually become a good team? That's what I'm waiting to see. Cavaliers have been a fairly successful team over the last 10 years, unable to make it to the conference finals or the finals, but still, almost every year, they're in the playoffs, they're in the thick of things. Despite making the playoffs 7 of the last 10 years, they have not drafted well. Maybe that has prevented them from really taking that next step to get beyond the second round of the playoffs. Looking at their roster, Mark Price and Reggie Miller, that was the backcourt, that was the duo. They had Purvis Short, Derek McKee, and small forward. Della Shrimp was there for a long time. Ralph Sampson was their center for a couple of seasons. Had some successful seasons with Ralph Sampson there. Eventually had Kevin Johnson take Mark Price's place as starting point guard. Terrell Brandon has been their point guard since 2001 season anyway. They have Tyrone Hill and LaFonso Ellis. But now they have Scottie Pippen at small forward. Tyrone Hill is still here at power forward. This is the 2003 roster. Dill Davis, Eldon Campbell, Matt Maloney, Chris Mills, Blue Edwards, Smoky Walker. Very interesting squad. This is a very interesting squad. They threatened the Hawks. They came really close. Can they get back? Can they get even further than they got last season? Or is this team starting to get a little too old? Is Scottie Pippen a little too old now? Was 2002 their year and they missed their chance? I hope that's not the case. I hope for big things in 03. The Boston Celtics had a dynasty in the 80s, but in the 90s they were far, far from that. Missed the playoffs 9 straight seasons until finally making the playoffs last year, and now they're looking pretty good. They had some whiffs early on in their rebuild. Khalid Reeves and Ellen Henderson weren't really all that great. Ray Allen, though, big draft pick in 96. Lamar Odom, Jamal Tinsley. They also traded Chauncey Billups and Bonzi Wills for Paul Pierce. That ended up being a big trade for obvious reasons. And now they have a pretty nice squad going on there in Boston. Checking out their roster, you could see why they were bad from 93 to 97. Larry Bird was there and Kevin McHale were there for a couple of seasons, but they were a shell themselves, just not very good. But last couple of seasons, they figured something out. Kenny Anderson, Ray Allen, Paul Pierce, Lamar Odom, Brian Grant. That starting 5 is really starting to catch on. They're really starting to click. And it's exciting to see Boston back in the playoffs, back to being relevant after a long time of not being remotely close to that. And it's going to be interesting in the future. Kenny Anderson is going to be a free agent after this season. Jamal Tinsley, who they drafted in 2001, in real life, he was a starter for a number of seasons for the Pacers. Could he be that guy for the Celtics? You know, they might decide to move on with Jamal Tinsley as their point guard. I keep almost saying power forward. Point guard, damn it. Point guard, Jamal Tinsley. he's probably going to take over after next season. That'll be interesting to see how that works. The Clippers were pretty mediocre for a good part of the 90s, but they were gradually building something interesting. And now that we're in 2003, it feels like they are one of the elite teams in the West. They definitely were playing that way the last season. They drafted Chris Webber, Peja Stojakovic, and Larry Hughes over the last 10 years, and those guys are starters on the team. Checking out the roster from 93 to 97, you had Terrell Brandon there, Jim Jackson, Dominique Wilkins was there for a little while. I forgot about that. Purvis Ellison, who they drafted, I think in 1990, was there for a long time. But then they eventually settled. They found a 75 that's worked for them. Obviously, when you trade for Penny Hardaway, that's going to help you big time. Penny Hardaway, Larry Hughes, Peja Stojakovic, Chris Webber, and Vlade Divac. 3 of those guys are part of the real-life Sacramento Kings squads of the early 2000s. You add Penny Hardaway and Larry Hughes to that mix, it's going to be a damn good team. 2003 roster, pretty much the same starting 5, the exact same starting 5 actually. Lionel Simmons is their 6th man. They threatened the Lakers last season. They took them to 7 games in the conference finals. Can they take that next step and actually become a finals contender? The Grizzlies started out as a pretty woeful team, as an expansion team those first couple of seasons, but ever since they drafted Vince Carter in 98, they have been pretty damn good. They moved to Memphis in 2001, and they won 51 games last year, making it to the conference semis. You can see Keith Van Horn, Vince Carter, and Samuel Delembert are still on the team. Those are guys that they drafted. They traded Michael Redd, who I was hoping would stick around. Stephon Marbury didn't quite work out with him and Vince Carter in the backcourt. And yet you can see those first few squads, just not a very talented team. They had some talented pieces, but didn't quite work well as a team early on in their inception. But Vince Carter came in 98, 99 season, and ever since 2000 have been very good. Jason Williams has been their starting point guard the last 3 seasons. Jalen Rose starting small forward. They got Theo Radcliffe as their center. Michael Redd, I think Michael Redd was traded for Theo Radcliffe. That's a mistake there in the rosters. He shouldn't be in the 2002 roster. Oh well. But starting 5, pretty much the same. The exact same as last year. Jason Williams, Vince Carter, Jalen Rose, Keith Van Horn, Theo Radcliffe, and then they got Corey Maggette coming off the bench. Samuel Delembert is still on the team. They also have Tony Dumas, and who else they got? Kevin Ollie, Melvin Booker, Eric Williams. Okay, nobody else. The other guys aren't that great, but everyone else, great team, great squad, lots of fun. Last 10 years for the Hawks have been very interesting. The end of the Dominique Wilkins era, a rebuild era, and then with Tim Duncan, Allen Iverson, they go ahead and win the championship in 2001, make the conference finals in 2002. Yes, you can see here, notable draft picks, Allen Iverson, Tim Duncan, 96, 97. They had Antonio McDyess for a little while there, but he didn't quite mesh with Tim Duncan in the front court, so he was traded to the Nets, and they have Deshaun Stevenson, who's still on the bench. Yeah, that squad from 93-97, you can see they evolved away from Dominique Wilkins and Ralph Sampson and Jay Humphries, and eventually they brought along Allen Iverson. And Tony McDyess was there, like I said, for a little while. Sean Bradley was their center for a couple of seasons as well. But then in 98, that 98 season, they had Tim Duncan, and after that, I mean, 44 wins in 99, 51 wins in 2000. And then they win the championship in 2001 with Steve Kerr coming off the bench. Darrell Armstrong was there. Chauncey Billups has been their point guard for the last couple of seasons. They won 62 games last year, but unfortunately, Eastern Conference Finals was the furthest they could go. But yeah, Chauncey Billups is back in 2003. Allen Iverson, Bonzi Wells, Tim Duncan, Dino Raja, same starting 5. You got Len Bias coming off the bench. They got Robert Pack. A very old Len Bias. Hopefully this is the year he finally wins a ring. I'm really hoping that happens for him. Malik Sealy's there, Felton Spencer, Jamie Feck, Jacques Vaughn, Michael Doleg. It's not the deepest team. They have a solid 8-man rotation, though. And I definitely think they can make it to the finals in 2003 and even win the championship. The Miami Heat first made the playoffs in '94 and haven't looked back since, but they've had a lot of first-round exits along the way. Last 2 years, though, they've been at their best, making the conference finals in '01, then making the finals in '02. So we'll see if they can continue on that path, or was that their peak? Was '02 their peak? They drafted Alonzo Mourning in '92 and Gary Payton in 1990, which they're the anchors of that squad. Gerald Wallace is on the bench. They drafted him in 2001. Those 90s teams, those 93, 97, you had Steve Smith, you had Tony Kukoc. Alfonso Ellis was there for a little while. P.J. Brown eventually became the starter. Nate McMillan coming off the bench for a little while there. Yeah, some interesting squads there, but then they settled on Clifford Robinson being their small forward. Drazen Petrovic was there as a two guard for a while, but now they have Kendall Gill. They got him last year, and he's still there. And yeah, Gerald Wallace. It'll be interesting to see if he eventually becomes a starter for them, or if they eventually trade him. Checking out their 2003 roster, not much change here. Gary Payton, Kendall Gill, Clifford Robinson, P.J. Brown, Alonzo Mourning, Jay Edwards coming off the bench, Dana Barros, Maurice Taylor, backup power forward. Yeah, the bench, I think, got a little bit weaker this season, but this is a team that made it to the finals, so hopefully their starting five is strong enough to carry them through the regular season into the playoffs. But I don't know. I'm getting this sense that '02 was their peak, and I don't know. I'm not feeling very confident this team can stay elite. So maybe I'm wrong, though. We'll see. The Charlotte Hornets were always on the cusp, making the playoffs throughout the 90s, and they got Michael Jordan in the offseason, and he took them to the finals in 2000. And they made the playoffs ever since, despite Michael Jordan retiring after 2001. And now they've moved to New Orleans, and what's going to happen to this team? They have Rashard Lewis still. He's the one notable draft pick that they still have over the last 10 years. Rasheed Wallace, I was hoping he could stay a Hornet, but he had to be traded for them to get Michael Jordan. Those 90 squads, they were so disappointing, but they were good. They had good players. I really don't understand why they were so underwhelming. Rod Strickland, Kendall Gill, Glenn Rice, Rasheed Wallace, Vlade Divac. These are all players that have succeeded elsewhere, but for some reason, all of them together just didn't quite mesh. But then they really started to turn things around. Obviously, when they got Michael Jordan, they had the Eric Snow start at point guard, Rashard Lewis, Terry Mills, Brad Daugherty was their center for a couple of seasons. He helped them. He was really underrated. Michael Jordan was getting all the attention, but Brad Daugherty was a great center for them, and he was at the end of his career, so he was a hell of a player for them. But they still have a good team. They still have a very good team. In 2003, it's going to be very interesting now. They're in New Orleans. They got Steve Francis as a starting point guard. This is a big, risky move. He wasn't moving the needle for the Jazz when they drafted him, but can he be the star point guard that the Hornets are hoping for? They got Cuttino Mobley, who was his backcourt teammate in real life, so I'm hoping that could work out in the sim. And then you got Jamal Mashburn, their main star. He was an all-star last season. Rashard Lewis is a hell of a player as well. Scott Pollard at center. Ricky Davis coming off the bench. Got Shamgod, Sharon Wright, Judd Buechler, Caron Butler coming off the bench. They traded away Drew Gooden as part of the deal to send Steve Francis to the Hornets. And yeah, can this squad... Can they make New Orleans excited for basketball, for the NBA? We'll see. Utah Jazz have not been very successful the last couple of years. They missed the playoffs every year since '96, and it feels like they're getting a little bit worse, but they're developing. It should be the opposite. The opposite should be happening. Over the years, they drafted Anton Jamison and Steve Francis. They're gone now. Kenyon Martin, Joe Johnson, Tayshaun Prince, they are the future. I'm hoping that they can be the cornerstone to turn this team around. The 93, 94, they still had Michael Adams, Hersey Hawkins, Chuck Person, and Tom Chambers. Those were the guys that made the Jazz a success in the late 80s and in the early to mid 90s. But after that, they were fumbling through becoming a rebuilding type team. They had a lot of players that just didn't make sense, didn't really fit right. Isaiah Thomas was there for some reason. Then they drafted Steve Francis, and they got worse. Steve Francis didn't really develop for them like they'd hoped. Anton Jamison didn't really become the star player they were hoping he'd be. Kerry Kittles was there, didn't do much for them. It's just been a lot of disappointment for the Utah Jazz. But I think this ship will eventually turn around. They got Eric Snow, Damon Jones, Tayshaun Prince, Kenyon Martin, Lorenzen Wright, Rafer Alston coming off the bench. I expect Joe Johnson to eventually become the starting shooting guard for the Jazz sooner than later. They also got Drew Gooden on the bench. They got a lot of interesting young players. You know, they're not going to be a playoff team right away. It's going to take some time. But I have faith that this team can figure it out. You know, they have the right pieces. I think this team will make sense eventually and come together and become interesting. But until that happens, there's going to be some more bad years. They also have Matt Barnes deep on the bench. He'll be fun to watch on this team. The Sacramento Kings had a hell of a run from 1988 to 2001. They didn't miss the playoffs. They even made the finals in 97. They were a hell of a squad, and they were fun to watch, especially in the mid-90s. And they didn't have any notable draft picks from 93 to 2002, but a big reason for that was the Charles Barkley trade. We'll get into that right now. You see, in the early 90s, before Barkley, they had Otis Thorpe as power forward. They brought in Barkley. He was on the squad with KJ, Hornacek, Mullen, Arvydas Sabonis. That was a really, really good squad, a really talented squad. And then they made it to the finals in 97, but they couldn't keep everybody after 97. So they had to get rid of Chris Mullen, and they replaced him with Reggie Williams, but he wasn't the same. Obviously he wasn't the same kind of player Mullen was. And ever since then, they just got worse and worse. And Charles Barkley left after 98. And Scottie Pippen was there for a couple of seasons, but he didn't really do much for them. Wasn't the impact player they were hoping he would be. And now it's 2003, and it feels like this team is in a rebuild, right? David Wesley's at point guard. He's solid. Antonio Daniels, Dennis Scott is here. LaFonso Ellis, Arvydas Sabonis, Chris Gatling, Austin Crozier. A couple of guys that were on the Suns squad last year. Hubert Davis, Pablo Prigioni. Actually, Hubert Davis was on the Kings last year. Prigioni was on the Suns. Raja Bell was also on the Suns. He's now on the Kings. Yeah, this team, they have the talent to maybe make a crack at the playoffs. We'll see if they could do that for Sabonis. But if things start out particularly poorly, we might even trade Sabonis. Try to get him a ring. We'll see. The New York Knicks were a perennial playoff team with Patrick Ewing until the very last year of his career, where they missed the playoffs, only winning 40 games in the regular season, and they never made it to the finals with Ewing. In real life, they were able to make it twice. They couldn't make it once in the sim to the finals, which is kind of crazy. And the only draft pick of note that they had the last 10 years was Jonas Ogaska, so they traded immediately into Orlando in 96. And as you see here, 93-97, they have Mark Jackson as a point guard for a long time. Latrell Sprewell was a two guard for the most part. Glenn Rice. Bernard King was there in 93, then retired. Glenn Rice replaced him. Then they had Charles Oakley and Patrick Ewing as the killer front court. Del Davis was coming off the bench for them, and he was a hell of a player for them. Eventually, they got John Starks in 97, and Latrell Sprewell moved to small forward. That seemed to work out nicely for them. Eventually, they got Anthony Mason, who was a bench player that eventually started in place of Charles Oakley. They had Charlie Ward for a number of seasons there. And Rod Strickland became their point guard in 02. Danny Manning was there for a little bit. Brent Barry was added to the team last year, as well as Joe Smith. And they're both still on the team. But the team has gone through a lot of changes because Ewing is no longer there. Rod Strickland is their starting point guard. Quentin Richardson, Richard Jefferson because of the Latrell Sprewell trade. Joe Smith, Chris Mim is their starting center. They got Brent Barry coming off the bench. Yeah, this is going to be a very, very different team. They might not be all that great. How bad can they be? Can they be a lottery team? Can they get one of the big 03 draft prospects? We'll see. Last 10 years saw a lot of change for the Los Angeles Lakers. Magic Johnson was still on the team in 93. He was there until the 98 season with James Worthy and company. They drafted Kobe in 96. They acquired Shaq in a trade before the 99 season and won a championship. And they won a second championship since then. And you can see, yes, they drafted Kobe thanks to a trade with Charlotte, which sent Vlade Divac over there and a future pick. I thought they were a pretty solid roster. Allen Robinson, Kevin Willis, a lot of Divac, Byron Scott. They had Doug Christie for a little bit, Joe Barry Carroll, D. Brown. But the team just wasn't able to get past second round or even the first round in most seasons. Then things turned around in a big way when they got Shaq. Shaq and Kobe were anchoring the team. They had Robert Horry, James Worthy in the 99 championship season. But the team now, Derek Fisher's back at starting point guard. Maybe we'll see if that sticks. It didn't really stick last year because he was underperforming. Kobe Bryant, Brian Russell, Tom Gugliotta, and Shaq is the rest of the starting five. Then you got Randy White coming off the bench. I really like their bench this year. Randy White, Darrell Armstrong, who I think will eventually start, Corliss Williamson, John Barry, Lamar Murray, Irvin Johnson. This team could repeat. I think they should be better this year than they were last year. The Orlando Magic had a lot of disappointing seasons in the 90s, but ever since 2000, they've righted the ship, and they've been improving ever since. Haven't been able to make it past the first round despite having Trace McGrady and Grant Hill, but I still think the future is bright in Orlando. A lot of draft picks that didn't end up, doing much for them. Jamal Mashburn, Eddie Jones, they were good players, but didn't lead to many wins. Lorenzen Wright, Antonio Daniels, and Scott Power were traded immediately after getting drafted. Andre Kirilenko. I wish I didn't have to trade him, but he had to be traded in order to bring in Grant Hill and Trace McGrady. You see here the roster from 93-97. Some good players in there. Larry Johnson was there for a couple of years. Jamal Mashburn, Eddie Jones, Brian Grant. A lot of these players are playing well and are successful on other teams, but they just couldn't make it work in Orlando. But ever since they got Trace McGrady and Grant Hill, things have been looking good. Ben Baker's there. They had Kurt Thomas for a while, but he's gone. Rick Smits was there. Now he's retired. Mookie Blaylock is still there. They got him last year in a trade. Quentin Richardson was there for a little while, but he's been traded as well. So let us see what the 2003 roster looks like now. Mookie Blaylock is the starting point guard again. Trace McGrady, Grant Hill, Roddy Rogers at power forward, and then Vin Baker now is going to be at center. We'll see how that works. We'll see if that ends up being a successful move, moving Vin Baker to center. Lindsey Hunter and Randy Woods coming off the bench. Keith Kloss, who looks pretty dynamic. He's been looking pretty good whenever we see him on the court. Chris Smith. The rest of the bench ain't all that, but they have a nice 8 guys. They got 8 guys who are pretty solid. So hopefully that means another playoff appearance, maybe a deep playoff run. Dallas Mavericks had a lot of disappointing seasons since 93, despite having a pretty good roster. Their best season was in 98 when they won 50 games and lost in the conference semis. But ever since then, it's been just a lot of disappointment. They had some good drafts: Grant Hill, Brian Grant, Aaron McKee, Kurt Thomas, but they traded a lot of those guys. They traded a lot of those guys for Larry Johnson. And then in 2000, they traded Grant Hill to Orlando for a bunch of promising young players. They do still have Hedo Turkoglu, who is progressing to become the starting small forward for the Mavericks. Let's look at their rosters from 93 to 97. Derek Harper was there for a long time for the Mavericks. Joe Dumars as well. Charles Barkley, Sam Bowie. And then they evolved once they got Grant Hill. They traded for Larry Johnson soon after that. They still had Joe Dumars for the longest time. Derek Harper still. And then the last couple of years, Chris Childs was their point guard for a little while. Mark Price. They've settled on their point guard position, it seems like, with Andre Miller. Larry Johnson had a crazy season last season, but he's like 32, 33 years old, so we'll see just how good he could be in the future for this team. But they have checking a look at the 2003 roster. Yeah, Andre Miller, Wesley Person, Hedo Turkoglu, Larry Johnson, Dikembe Mutombo. Some nice players there. I think they definitely are capable of making the playoffs. Roy Marble's coming off the bench. They traded for him in the middle of last season. He was in the Rockets to start the season, then he got traded to the Mavericks. So they were 43-39 last year. Got swept by the Lakers. Couldn't generate any offense. They have Andre Miller's a hell of a playmaker for them. Larry Johnson averaged 35 points per game for them. We'll see how he meshes well with Hedo now being in the starting lineup. And Mutombo, they traded for him when they saw they might have an opportunity to make the playoffs. They tried to make a playoff push by trading for Mutombo. That only led to a 43-win season, so it's kind of not quite sure just exactly how much Mutombo elevates this squad. But we'll see how things go early on in the 03 season, whether or not this is the starting five, whether this should remain the starting five, I should say. The New Jersey Nets have been quietly pretty steady these last 10 years. No highs, no super lows, just kind of in the middle there, in the middle ground. Borderline lottery team. Sometimes they make the playoffs. Sometimes they win up to 48, 49, or even 50 wins like they did in 98. Made it to the second round that year. But they have something interesting brewing in New Jersey. I'm pretty excited to see if they can take that next step finally towards becoming a conference finals caliber team. See, they have Sean Marion and Louis Scola, who they drafted pretty recently. They're still on the team. We look back at their roster from 93-97. Tim Hardaway was there for the most part. He was their big star point guard, but they couldn't do much with him. They didn't get very far with him. They had Jeff Malone, Kiki Vandeweghe, a lot of veterans just came and went. Roy Hinton, Michael Cage, Stacey Augmon was there for a long time. Cedric Ceballos. But then they traded for Steve Nash. They traded for Steve Nash after the 96 draft. Tim Hardaway was shipped to San Antonio. And since then, they've had this... They got rid of some of the old guys, and now they have this newer, younger squad. It includes Fashawn Leonard, Sean Marion, who they were able to draft because they got the number one pick in 99. And they have Zydrunas Ilgauskas, Anthony McDyess. So they have a nice group of young players. Maybe they need somebody extra to really get that team to that next level. Let's see if they have that extra piece this year. Steve Nash is starting point guard once again. Fashawn Leonard, Sean Marion, Anthony McDyess, Zydrunas Ilgauskas. Solid starting five. This was the starting five last year that won 44 games, but a lot of those players have gotten a bit better. So we're hoping that shows in the record. They have Tony Kukoc, J.R. Reed, Jeff McInnes, Malik Allen coming off the bench, Frankie King, Robert Traylor, Louis Scola, who I'm excited to see how he develops, Defend George as well. Yeah, fun little squad here, hoping that they actually do some damage sooner than later. The Denver Nuggets had a fun squad in the mid to late 90s, made it as far as the conference finals in 98. That was an interesting year in 98. You had the Mavericks going to second round, Nets going second round, Nuggets going to the conference finals. Since 2000, though, this team has kind of been wallowing in mediocrity. They did draft Darius Miles in 2000, but traded him soon after. But looking back at that fun squad, let's see who they had. They had Mookie Blaylock, Dan Marley, Reggie Williams, and Charles Smith. Dikembe Mutombo was the center. And they were a successful team. They made the playoffs on a regular basis, a perennial basis. They had a nice bench. Randy Woods, Bo Kimball, Harold Miner, William Bedford, Doug Overton, Ron Grandison, Smokey Walker. Irvin Johnson was there for quite a while. And then if you see 98 through 2002, you can see they really peaked. Christian Laettner became the starting power forward at some point. But after, 2000, when things took a turn, guys got a little bit older. They got Steve Smith, but that didn't lead to anything substantial. Oliver Miller, Robert Pack. They got Sam Cassell now. They've improved. They improved to 41-41 last season. But how good could this team be? I don't know. Sam Cassell, Steve Smith is there. Steven Jackson is now the starting small forward. Anton Jamison is now there. Luke Longley. Michael Williams is their backup point guard, who he was on the Pacers for a long, long time. They got Nazir Muhammad from a trade with the Lakers, and some other bench guys. This is a team that refuses to tank. They don't want to completely tank, right? Because, Denver's a mid-market team. They're not really interested in that. They're trying to win with the guys that they have, and let's see if they're able to do that. The Indiana Pacers' last 10 years have been unique in that they've lost in the second round 7 times. 7 times in 10 years, and that includes 5 straight years where they lost in the second round, from the 93 season to the 97 season. They had some nice draft picks. Michael Finley and Eric Dampier in particular. You see, they were really consistent with their roster. Michael Williams, Mitch Richmond, Chris Morris, Karl Malone, Benoit Benjamin. That was pretty much the guys for about 5 seasons. And then when they drafted Michael Finley and Eric Dampier, they gradually integrated them into the rotation and then eventually the starting lineup. So by 98, you had Michael Finley as the starting small forward. By 99, Eric Dampier was the starting center because Benoit Benjamin, I think he retired at that point, or he was close to retirement. He was declining. So what does that mean for 2003? Well, they traded away Karl Malone. So now this is their starting five: Charlie Ward, Michael Finley, Jerry Stackhouse, Anthony Mason, and Eric Dampier. They also got Terry Mills as their sixth man, Oliver Miller as their backup big, and Corey Alexander, Scott Burrell. Solid team, very, very decent, solid team. A lot of their guys are leaving in free agency next year, so this might be the end of an era for the Pacers. They might start a rebuild after this season. Last 10 years for the Detroit Pistons, you had the end of the Isaiah Thomas, Dennis Rodman, Ron Harper, Bill Laimbeer era, and they drafted Kevin Garnett in 95, and they had a slow ascension towards becoming a playoff team. They drafted Baron Davis in 99. That's what really propelled them. They won 55 games last year, but lost in the first round. You see here, Kevin Garnett, Brad Miller, and Baron Davis have been their big draft pickups over the last couple of years. They drafted Richard Jefferson 2 seasons ago, but he got traded to the Knicks for Latrell Sprewell. So as you see here, you can see Isaiah Thomas was there until 97, maybe even a year after that. Ron Harper got traded after the 94 season. Dennis Rodman left after the 94 season. So yeah, you can see how the roster was evolving away from the bad boy era into the Kevin Garnett era. And then late 90s, early 2000s, Brian Russell was there for a little while. Serge Sabalos, Stacey Augmon, Lindsey Hunter. See the starting lineup for 2003: Baron Davis, Latrell Sprewell, Cedric Sabalos, Kevin Garnett, Brad Miller. So the hope is that Latrell Sprewell can elevate them even further. They won 55 games last season, but they lost in the first round to the Celtics. So the hope is that that Sprewell can get them over the hump, maybe even make a finals push with Sprewell, Baron Davis, and Kevin Garnett. It's possible. It could happen, but I'm not holding my breath. The Toronto Raptors are the one team in this sim never to have made the playoffs in the last 10 years, but that's to be expected since they were an expansion team that joined the NBA in 95. That being said, Grizzlies, also an expansion team from 95. They made the playoffs twice, so what's the Raptors' excuse? They had some pretty good draft picks. Ben Wallace, Mike Bibby, Pau Gasol, Tracy McGrady, they drafted in 97, and he left a couple of years later. That definitely did hurt their chances to make the playoffs, whereas the Grizzlies, they drafted Vince Carter in 98, and they still have him. So yeah, that probably was a big reason why they've struggled to make the playoffs since their inception. But hey, Pau Gasol's there now. Mike Bibby's still the starting point guard. Ben Wallace has been there since the second year they've been in the league. Let's take a look at the first couple of years of their existence. Right, Matt Maloney, Hubert Davis, Danielle Marshall, Hot Rod Williams was on the squad. Joe Smith, who was the first player they ever drafted. Ben Wallace eventually became the starting center for them. And in the last couple of years, you see Tracy McGrady was there for a hot minute. Then he bailed for Orlando. But now I feel like they've settled. They've really settled on a roster that I like. If we look at the 2003 roster, you'll see that they still have Mike Bibby, Doug Christie, Wally Szczerbiak, Pau Gasol, and Ben Wallace. That hasn't changed. My hope is that with Pau Gasol, he'll continue to improve and develop, and Mike Bibby will continue to improve and develop as well. Wally Szczerbiak too, and maybe this team could really be something. I don't know if they'll make the playoffs this year, but I think they definitely have the capability to do so. Houston Rockets had a hell of a team in the mid-90s, man. For 5 years in a row, they didn't win less than 55 games, and they made 5 conference finals from 93 to 97. That's a pretty impressive era of basketball for the Rockets there, with Hakeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler, etc. They had some notable draft picks lately. Desmond Mason, in particular, Eddie Curry, Nene, and Smush Parker. We'll see how those guys develop in the coming years. But if you look at the roster from 93 and 97, Doc Rivers was their point guard for the championship team in 94. Clyde Drexler. Roy Marble, who is a sim star, not exactly a guy who did a lot in real life, but he's a star in the sim, sort of borderline star. And they have Hakeem. Tyrone Hill was a power forward for a little while. B.J. Armstrong was their point guard, 96, 97. If you look at 98 through 2002, you can see they had an interesting squad in 2000 when they had Charles Barkley and Scottie Pippen, but that only led to a 41-41 season. Very disappointing. And eventually, all those guys either left the team, retired, or got traded. And now the team is completely different now. Let's see what the 2003 roster looks like, in fact. So the point guard is Brevin Knight. Desmond Mason's the starting shooting guard. Len Rice at the 3. Got Elton Brand, the power forward, and Jason Williams, the starting center. So they made a trade with the 76ers, giving up a couple of future picks to get Brevin Knight and Elton Brand. This team does not want to just wallow in mediocrity. They're hoping that this team could actually be noticeably better than they've been the last 2 seasons with some key young players on their squad. We'll see how it works out for them. They got some interesting guys on the bench who could develop over the next coming years, and we'll see how that turns out for them. San Antonio Spurs, 8 playoff appearances in the last 10 years, but never made the conference finals with David Robinson. He still has a couple of years left. Maybe it could happen in the future, but it felt like they had their chance and they missed it. I feel increasingly that is going to be the case for David Robinson. They had one notable draft for the last 10 years, Steve Nash. They traded for Tim Hardaway. And from 93 to 97, you see their rosters, decent players, but no one who could really get this team to help David Robinson get to that next level, right? The conference finals, the finals, etc. So they had Terry Cummings for a while, Kenny Green, Ricky Barry, Fat Lever, Avery Johnson. Finally, they traded for Tim Hardaway in 97, and they've had him as their point guard ever since. But that team from 99 to 2001, that was the team that really should have done something. Doug Christie was on that team, Derek McKee, then later Len Bias, and later Sean Elliott. They kind of had they kept changing the small forward position, trying to fine-tune it, tweak it to make the team even better. Then Dennis Rodman and David Robinson was a hell of a front court, but they just couldn't get past second round. Crazy. They even won 61 games in 2001, and it still couldn't get past second round. 2003 roster, you got Tim Hardaway, John Starks, Sean Elliott, Antoine Walker, David Robinson. A lot of older vets, and you have Antoine Walker is a bit younger. Interesting mix of players there. Khaled Reeves, Gary Trent, Chris Carr, Brian Steeth. Yeah, this is probably another Spurs team that'll win about 50 games. They're probably losing the first round, or maybe the second round. But yeah, I'm just not. It's kind of hard at this point because a lot of the guys on the team make a lot of money, and it's hard to make any moves to make this team a championship team with David Robinson. So we'll see. We'll see if there's something that we could do in the near future, but I'm not sure if that's going to happen. The Phoenix Suns were a perennial playoff team in the 90s, but like other squads, guys got old, and the newer guys that they brought in just didn't live up to the guys that they shipped out. So that's kind of the story with the Suns. And then the last couple of years, man, they have plummeted, right? From 40 wins, 29 wins to 9 wins. What is going on in Phoenix? That being said, they've drafted Amari Stoudemire in 2002. Year before that, Tony Parker, Rafe LaFrentz. So this team definitely has the players to get right back into the playoff mix. We just got to see them actually execute, develop and execute. Looking back at the rosters from 93 to 97, Danny Ainge, Kenny Smith, Sean Elliott, Danny Manning, and Brad Daugherty, that was the team that was giving other Western Conference teams fits in the playoffs. They made the finals as a 7th seed in 93, made the finals before that as well in 92. In 94 and 95, they couldn't make it past second round, but they were giving the Kings and the Rockets big-time trouble. By 98, though, the team had some overhaul. Blue Edwards became their starting shooting guard. Sam Cassell was their point guard. Eventually, they shipped out Danny Manning, Brad Daugherty, eventually Sean Elliott as well. And now they're integrating these younger players into the roster. I wouldn't even say mixed results. It's been poor results thus far, but there's hope that maybe they could turn things around in the near future. Looking at the 2003 roster, it looks like this: Tony Parker, Michael Redd, James Posey, Amari Stoudemire, Rafe LaFrentz. On the bench, you got Reggie Lewis, Kwame Brown, Earl Watson, Mark Jackson. So they got some older vets mixed in with some younger players: Darius Miles, Deion Glover, Udonis Haslam. A lot of interesting players. A lot of interesting players on the Suns. Uh, they could be a fun team to watch as far as seeing how these young players develop. But as far as playoff aspirations, probably not for another couple of years. The Supersonics had a slow start to the sim in the 80s, but they've really come along, especially since around 1996 when they made the conference finals for the first time since their heyday in the late 70s. And they've made 4 conference finals appearances in total in the last 10 years, and 1 finals appearance where they lost to the Bulls. Only notable draft pick, however, in the last 10 years, Raja Bell, who they traded to the Suns soon after they got him. So not much draft success in Seattle, but they still have a hell of a roster, guys who have been there for quite a number of seasons now, and they're still hoping that they could one day win the championship. They've had Abdul Rauf and Sean Kemp as their starting point guard and power forward for the last decade. Petrovic was there for a number of years. Clifford Robinson too. Derek McKee. McKee's been everywhere, it seems. Rick Smits was there for the longest time. Then he left for Orlando last season. Now he's finally retired. Spud Webb was a really important part of their team, coming off the bench for a long time. Last couple of years, Bruce Bowen became their starting small forward. They added Nick Anderson, who elevated the squad. I mean, they won 59 games in 2001, which is no small feat. They replaced Rick Smits with Isaac Austin last season, and he's been solid for them. But they did go from 59 wins to 48 wins in the last 2 years. So I'm wondering if they're on a downslope right now, the Supersonics. Checking out the 2003 roster: Abdul Rauf, Nick Anderson, Bruce Bowen, Sean Kemp, Isaac Austin. Same as last year. Elmore Spencer is coming off the bench. Let's see who else is on the bench as I slowly scroll to the right. You got Eldridge Rakasner, Jonathan Bender, Vitaly Potapenko. Yeah, really, really solid squad. Still a playoff caliber squad, but it does feel like they're not quite as good as they used to be. The Timberwolves have definitely been one of the more disappointing teams over the last decade. They've had some nice rosters, but they, for some reason, they just couldn't make the playoffs for the longest time. Finally, 2002, they broke the mold. They finally got over the hump and made the playoffs, but just barely. And they didn't win a playoff game last season, so still feels like there's some work to be done. They got Jermaine O'Neal still and Ron Artest, Morris Peterson, of the players they've drafted over the last decade. Allen Houston, Jalen Rose, Antoine Walker, Jason Williams are among the other players they drafted, but those guys they're all long gone now. Taking a look at the rosters from 93-97, some nice players there for sure. Kenny Anderson was their point guard for the longest time. They had Allen Houston, Christian Laettner, Chris Gatling, Luke Longley, Dennis Scott, Kenny Green, Kevin Duckworth, Jermaine O'Neal, who they drafted in 96, and he's still on the team. Eventually has become the starter. But these guys have panned out in other places, but for some reason the Wolves, not too great. They traded for Stephon Marbury in 2000, and that seemed to have gotten them to around being a playoff caliber team. They let go of Brian Russell after 2001 because Ron Artest became good enough to be the starter. They still have Ron Harper on the team, Jermaine O'Neal still the starting power forward, Antonio Davis still the starting center. So it feels like maybe they've found something here with their roster. Marbury, Ron Harper, Ron Artest, O'Neal, and Antonio Davis, Sean Bradley coming off the bench, Morris Peterson coming off the bench. So yeah, maybe they found something finally. Maybe they're finally a playoff caliber team. They did make the playoffs last year. I feel like there's no reason why they can't do it again in 2003. But can they do better than that? Can they be a second round exit type team? A conference finals appearance? Is that in their future? Looking back at the Blazers for the last 10 years, very similar to the Hawks and the Pistons in that they had a great team in their 80s and early 90s, went through a rebuild, and now things feel like they're starting to percolate. It feels like they have a interesting playoff caliber squad brewing over there in Portland right now. Had some nice draft picks, especially the last couple of years. Damon Stoudemire, Sharif Abdur-Rahim, Tony Batty, and Richard Hamilton. Hamilton has been really, really fun to watch. I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't sure just how good he'd be, and he's been really great for the Blazers. You can see they had Drexler, back in '93. Clark Kellogg, Terry Porter was there for the longest time. Marshall Lonis had a cup of coffee with this team. Dino Raja, who they drafted, they eventually let go of after '96. But yeah, they went through a long rebuild, and things didn't really start to take shape until they got Rasheed Wallace before the 2000 season. So their current roster looks like this: Damon Sotomayor, Rip Hamilton, Sharif Abdul-Rahim, Rasheed Wallace, and Tony Batty. That's pretty much starting five now. Radmanovich was on the team for a little bit last year, but now he's on the Sixers. Danny Fortson, I don't think he's on the team anymore either. Devin George, I think he's on the Rockets. So, but yeah, overall though, this team has been a solid middle of the pack Western Conference team. We'll see if they can take another step towards being a team that can make a deep run in the playoffs. So as I mentioned, there's the starting five. Well, actually, it looks like Birdman, Chris Anderson, is the starting center at this point. Harold Miner is on the bench. Ed Gray, Tony Batty, Calbert Cheney, Richard Dumas, Bo Kimball, Raul Lopez, Gordon Kiricek. Definitely an interesting team. We'll see how this upcoming season goes for them. But let's take a look at the core. I forgot to add this core in the last episode. I decided to go with this core for the Blazers because I can't find one that has the giant logo in the middle and the Rose Garden decals, which is what they had in 2003. But yeah, we'll go with this core. It's kind of bright, which I'm a little bit worried about. So I'm hoping that doesn't become a problem when we jump into games. But it's certainly a nice, snazzy looking core for sure. Golden State Warriors, interesting 10 years to say the least. They had their rebuild, and then they won the championship in 2000 with Jason Kidd as their starting point guard. They beat the Hornets, Michael Jordan in the Hornets in 2000. But then they've dropped off hard. 45 wins and 36 wins the last 2 years. What is going on there? Isaiah Ryder, Jason Kidd, Juwan Howard, they drafted in 93 and 94, and they're still the team. They're still starters on this team. But maybe they shouldn't be, at least a couple of those guys. We'll talk about that a little bit. But yeah, things really started to take shape for the Warriors when they drafted Jason Kidd in 94. They won 43 games in 96 with John Starks in their backcourt. Andrew Kennedy was their small forward. Terry Catledge, Juwan Howard. They've had Rex Chapman in the past, Mark Strickland, Phil Harrington, Dana Barros. Definitely some interesting players from that era. Last couple of years, especially the 2000 season, they had Allen Houston as their starting shooting guard, Horace Grant as their power forward, and Juwan Howard as their center, Earl Boykins, Brent Barry, Phil Harrington. You look at that roster and you're like, really? Championship caliber? And yeah, I guess so. But they've really fallen off a cliff these last 2 years and missed the playoffs entirely in 2002. Let's see what the roster looks like now. For 03, Jason Kidd, Allen Houston, Isaiah Ryder, Juwan Howard, they're still on the team. But they added Karl Malone, who was on the Pacers for a decade and a half in this sim. We'll see how Karl Malone elevates the squad, if he elevates the squad at all. Definitely going to be an interesting dynamic to play with, Karl Malone being on this team with Jason Kidd throwing him the ball. So, yeah, we'll see how that goes. Finally, the Washington Wizards, formerly known as the Bullets. Last 10 years, we saw the back half of John Stockton's career, where they were a perennial playoff team, always winning over 50 games. Last 3 years, though, hard rebuild, a lot of losing. But they drafted Gilbert Arenas and Yao Ming, and man, that's going to be a lot of fun to watch. Can't wait to see how that unfolds as we get into the 2003 season. But let's take a look at the roster from 93-97. A lot of consistency. John Stockton, Reggie Lewis, Len Bias, Terry Mills, Cliff Robinson until 95. Robinson retired after that year. Then they went with Michael Cage, then Luke Longley as their starting center. In 96 and 97. They also had some interesting bench players over the years. Gerald Wilkins, David Rivers, Ken Norman, John Sally, Nate Blackwell, Sadell Threat. But this team has gone through some major overhauling these last couple of years. They had Chris Smith starting at point guard for a season, then Andre Miller, who's now on the Mavericks. Damon Jones, he's now on the Jazz. Derek Coleman, I think he's retired, or I don't know. I'm actually quite sure where he's at. George Mirasan, Scott Skiles, he definitely retired. Ricky Davis, he's now on the Hornets. 2003 roster looks like this: Gilbert Arenas, Kerry Kittles, Mike Miller, Christian Laettner, Yao Ming, Dan Murray coming off the bench. I'm excited for this Wizards team. I don't know if they can make the playoffs, but I definitely think they'll be a fun team to watch, particularly with Arenas and Yao Ming. And I'm excited. I can't wait to see how this team looks on the court. All right, guys, I am done with this episode. Episode 200 is officially in the books, on the books. I'm leaving you with some top five lists that I put together because I was worried about how to end this episode. I wasn't quite sure how to do it. And I'm just going to end it like this. I'm going to end it exhausted and tired and wanting to go to sleep. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. Listen, though, I'm really excited to start 2003 season and beyond. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. And hope you enjoyed this video. If you stuck this long, you are a trooper. Like the video, subscribe. Future videos will be much more exciting than this one, I assure you. But thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.